if you have the hard conversation up front and you only do as much as that you have resources to do, then you're going to get what you want at the other end and in a predictable fashion. If you put twice as much work in there as you have resources to do, now the system is sort of making the decision about what you work on and what you don't. It's a hard thing to get your head around, and those no
Yeah.
conversations are tough. But once you build that skill, it gives you so much more control. And then you're choosing your strategy and you're kind of managing the system rather than it managing you.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My guest is Nelson Repenning. He's professor of system dynamics and organization studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His new book, There's Got to Be a Better Way, documents how applying the dynamic work design model helps organizations dominate their industry. Nelson's background in competitive cycling informs his philosophy of wanting to help companies run like a well-oiled machine. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Nelson Repenning. Nelson, welcome to the podcast.
Michael, it's awesome to see you and reconnect. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you.
It's really great to reconnect, and it's so interesting. I have this podcast. It's all about high performance and high performers, and what I've been realizing, a really just a essential element to high performance is understanding the system in which you interface with. And there's so many high performers out there who have great intentions and they don't have the awareness of the system. So you can have all the ambition, all the great intentions in the world, but if you don't understand how the system works in which you interface, you can burn out, you can be resentful, you can quit, all these things can happen. So I'm really excited. I think this podcast can be really helpful for the people that I work, people listening, to really understand the system. And once you understand that, it's a game changer. So I'm excited to talk to you, especially about your new book that's coming out, and it's all about systems. So I want to ask you, what was the inspiration for the book?
So it's a great question, and I think you sort of captured the essence really well, which is I've spent my life studying how organizations work and how people can succeed in organizations. And this book, in some ways, represents the culmination of 30 years of research and work. And really, where it all got started is when I was a PhD student a million years ago. The topic I ended up studying was there were a set of tools and practices that everybody agreed were good things to do. So back then, this is a long time ago, a lot of it was the tools that had come out of the Asian manufacturers like Toyota. So it was lean production and total quality management and a whole bunch of other things. Everyone agreed these were good things to do, and there was good data that they actually worked. And yet, most companies didn't use them or didn't use them well. And as I dug into this, I realized this was a really common phenomenon that happens in big organizations and small organizations. And as you probably know better than me, same thing goes for our personal lives, right? There's lots of things that we should do, like, go to the gym or eat well or whatever. And yet it turns out to be hard to make commitments to those on a regular basis. So that's kind of the thing I've been working on my whole life in some sense. And sort of the first part of that research was more diagnostic, which we could talk about. But then, so the second half of my career has been, okay, now we have a diagnosis. What do we do about it? And the book really is sort of my answer to that question about, particularly for organizations, how do we rearrange that system so that we can do what we think is right on a regular basis? And it's not, and work isn't such a frustrating place to be.
Right, right. So your book really talks a lot about dynamic systems, right? So dynamic work systems as opposed to static work system. Now, there's no probably work system that's perfectly static and none that's perfectly dynamic, but you really focus on that dynamic system, especially like the workflow. So in your book, there's a great example, I think, of Harley Davidson, and when they came out with this new engine. And I think it was called like the Twin Cam 88 or something like that.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it's what you point out in the book is that oftentimes an organization will need an audacious endeavor or a crisis or something to disrupt the current system to really kick it in gear and get the system right. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about either Harley Davidson or any kind of the company that you've worked with where they were able to really take either a crisis or a big endeavor and just get everything reorganized and get a better workflow.
Yeah, so there's probably two ways to answer that, which is number one of the things that's really come out of all my work with organizations over my career is you can take the most screwed up organization, and when they have a crisis, like all the BS kind of temporarily melts away and they become really functional. And so, one of my favorite examples is, where I work at MIT, it's a pretty typical academic bureaucracy. It takes us a long time to get anything done. And, it was only like 5 years ago that we still used a carbon paper form when we had to serve alcohol at student events. Like, I always thought like there was one factory left in the world that we were keeping open that made carbon paper. But then during COVID, like when we suddenly had 3 months to get students back on campus safely, we were amazing, right? We created a custom app, we installed card swipe terminals at every door, we created testing. Like it was really impressive. And I've seen this in many other organizations. Like, wow, all the bureaucracy goes away and people are focused, the work flows. And then when the crisis is over, we go back to the same sort of stuff. And I would imagine everyone who's listening has sort of experienced that. And so, one of the questions I've been really trying to think about is how can we get that level of performance without having to really screw something up first or have a natural disaster like a pandemic? Um, and so Harley's a nice example. So my co-author in the book, Don Keiffer, was a longtime executive there, and they had exactly this dynamic, which is, when they were doing new motorcycles, new projects, things would go slowly and there'd be hiccups. And then when they would kind of get to the last couple of months, suddenly it was all hands on deck and people were flying to the plants at all hours with a suitcase full of parts and they would get it done and they would get it done every time and they were really justifiably proud of it, but they didn't really fully appreciate the sort of wake of all the trouble that they had left behind them, and it would get worse sort of every year after that. And so some of my early work was on this thing called firefighting, which is basically showing how once you kind of fall into that crisis management mode, particularly in product development, the fire kind of spreads from model year to model year, and pretty soon you kind of end up into this mess where basically crisis is the only way that things ever get done. And so Don's and my early collaboration was on this new engine, the Twin Cam 88. And basically what we were trying to do is surface the problems early so that they could tackle them when they were small and kind of fix the system as it went. And, it didn't work perfectly. The engine was a couple of years late, although it was a huge success. But boy, were they able to fix a lot of problems and leave a healthier product development process along the way. And that was kind of the birth of dynamic work design, was all that little problem solving that happened along the way. Now, we didn't have that label yet, but that's, as it turns out, where we were headed.
That's super interesting. So that you're surfacing the problem before it inevitably shows up, right? During a more intense productive phase, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true in product development, but probably in life as well, but particularly when developing new products, a problem that you could fix, 2 years out with a mouse click or an eraser, if you let it go, can cost millions of dollars when it's, happens in the factory, because now I have to recut production tools or, there's warranty problems in even worse cases. So, and this is a big problem that organizations have, I think, particularly big ones, is, often there's not a lot of incentive to reveal a problem, 2 years out when it's cheap to fix. And so creating the system that will kind of force those problems to come to the surface so you can deal with them when they're small is a really key part of being effective.
Yeah, that seems essential because, like you're talking about the firefighting mode, right? That is, people can do that short term.
Yeah.
And actually that's a good skill to have. Sometimes you need to do that, but like it's not a sustainable model. And there's so many organizations that work in firefighting mode. And, a lot of clients I work with, they're executives or they're business owners that are working in some sort of organization, then they get frustrated with this firefighting mode. And I think that's, it's so pervasive. I mean, I hear it from other people, you've seen it. And the way that your work helps organizations is it's getting them really honest with, and almost sometimes like embarrassingly honest. Like there's a story in your book of, I think it was the Toyota CEO came into Harley and kind of like was almost a little bit rude, but like very knowledgeable, you know. So that must be hard for you in working with organizations to get to sell them into this let's surface the problems, because it's such a paradigm of kind of like keeping embarrassing things kind of under wraps. There's not a lot of incentive, as you say, for someone to surface a problem because they're worried, hey, am I going to get fired? Am I going to get blamed? So how do you sell that to an organization? Like, we are going to suss out the problems here.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one of the things that I always say, and again, I think, there's lots of parallels between the kinds of work I do and the kinds of work you do, is every successful change effort I've ever been involved in has started with a new level of candor, in the
Mm.
sense of let's just be honest about where we are.
Right.
Our products are late or our safety is bad or whatever it might be. And I mean, one of the other places I've worked a lot, particularly after Harley, was in high hazard environments like oil refineries and nuclear power plants. And there, surfacing problems early can be pretty scary, but a lot less scary than when you have something blow up or something like that what's happened. So the way that we have that we've had the best luck in getting people to do that is in our problem-solving method that we describe in the book, and we teach a class at MIT where students have to go through this problem-solving method. Is the second step is what we call go see and assess, and this is something we learned from Toyota, and that little story is about one of the Toyota kind of consultants walking my co-author through this. But basically, we tell them is once you've figured out what problem you want to solve, is just go see the work. Go to the shop floor, go sit with the engineers who are doing the work. Go watch customers being served or whatever. And the guidance we give the students is when you do this, if you're not embarrassed by what you find, you're just not looking closely enough. And the reason for that is not because you have bad people working for you or with you. It's because organizations are big, complicated places. And particularly if you've lived in that firefighting mode, right? Everyone with the best of intentions is kind of getting out their duct tape and safety pins and chewing gum to try to hold the place together. But what's happening is the way the work is actually done is just this amalgam of all these little adjustments or workarounds that people have made, to hold it together. And so probably my favorite moment in all of my teaching is, I send the students out on their projects and I say, just go see the work. And they're like, yeah, I'm not going to find anything embarrassing. And that idiot at MIT doesn't know what he's talking about. And then when they come back, usually 3 weeks later, I was like, so did anybody find anything embarrassing? And their eyes are about this big because they're like, I have no idea how we did work in my organization.
Yeah.
Uh, and to give you, one or two examples, I had a student this year who's a kidney transplant surgeon. And so his project, they were trying to turn over the operating room faster. And so, I made him go watch the work. And he was watching nurses getting ready for the equipment, like the scalpels and all stuff, which I don't really understand. He's like, they would sometimes have to open multiple kits, 6, 7, or 8, before they'd find one that was actually clean, right?
Mm.
And obviously it's pretty important when you're doing a major organ
Yeah.
transplant. And so then he kind of works backward to the room where they do the cleaning, and he found all these little sort of hiccups where the technicians and the nurses had sort of learned to live with this broken system, again, with the best of intentions, but it just didn't add up to the results they wanted. So our experience has been is that once people see what's actually happening with their own eyes, particularly more senior executives, that then kind of opens them up like, wow, there's a whole level of, opportunity here of low-hanging fruit that we can go after. So that's been the thing that works best. I've seen other people try things like we have amnesty where surface your problems now, and I think that kind of works. But again, I've seen no substitute for just engaging directly with the folks on the ground who are trying to get the work done. That has tended to be pretty successful.
Nice, nice. So it's really observing what you take for granted, right? Hey, the system's working. It doesn't mean
Right.
it's working at its best, so you have
Right.
no incentive to go sniffing out problems. But what you're saying is do some field research, get down there on if it's an assembly line or whatever the workflow is, you get in there as the executive and you just hang out and you go, why is that doing that? And
Yep.
you just ask questions and gather data. That is huge. And it takes, a consultant like yourself to come in and sell this. It's like, just because it's working doesn't mean it's working its best. It makes me think of like family systems. So I'm a psychotherapist and I also do executive coaching, and thinking about this concept of homeostasis in systems,
Yeah.
like in biology, right? So a system will seek out kind of the most efficient. It's like how the brain works too. You can have really bad habits, but your incentive to change is not great because the habits are making getting you through to the end of the day. And that's really all the brain cares about. So for you to come in and sell this concept, I think it's helpful to come in as an outside consultant because then there's less embarrassment, there's less relationship disruption because you're coming in as a professional service. Whereas if, say, the CEO proposed this to the board, there's all those personality dynamics there. There's a lot on the line. They're putting their name on the line. But for you, you're putting basically your name and your expertise on the line. So it's an easier sell, I think, coming from someone who's outside of that relational circle, don't you think?
Yeah, totally. And I think, I often give this pitch, particularly when I send students to go out to do projects. And I'll say, look, our students are going to ask you 100 questions, in
Yeah.
this little project. 90 of them are going to be kind of dumb, right? They don't know your work and your world as well as you do. And frankly, I don't think my ratio is a lot better. I mean, I have more gray hair, so maybe only 80 of mine are stupid or something like that. But I think the payoff is it's the fresh eyes, right?
Yeah.
Which is as again, better than me, habituation is such a strong force, and we just get accustomed to our
Yeah.
surroundings and our brains adapt. And as a consequence, some of the biggest opportunities for improvement are right in front of you. And, in the book, there's another story about one of my former students that ran this plant, and he would walk through the plant every day and was literally, this is not a metaphor, tripping over opportunities for improvement. And he just didn't notice it. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm any smarter than him. In fact, I'm quite sure I'm certainly not. But you walk, as you know, past anything every day. After a while, you just sort of code that as normal. So yeah, I think fresh eyes are super helpful. Um, and I think almost anything that we can do to get people to use a little bit more of that high-powered, expensive conscious processing and get them out of
Mhm.
automatic mode to see their world, whether it's keep a journal or draw a process map or, sit and count how many widgets people make. Or, the analogy I always think of is like, whenever I take the time to actually put in my app the food I eat every day, I'm like, oh, geez, there's all these calories. I didn't know that I was sneaking in there. I think it's all kind of the same thing. So yeah, there's valuable of fresh eyes or value to
Mhm.
fresh eyes or just forcing you to document what you're
Mhm.
actually doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hugely revealing. And when we can get students or clients to do that, often the improvement follows pretty easily once they have the fresh eyes, because in a lot of cases it's fairly easy, you know, easy to exercise the early wins. It gets harder as you
Yeah.
get better at what you're doing, but
Yeah. Yeah, you need those fresh eyes. It's absolutely true because you're coming with fresh eyes. You're like everything is new to your eyes, so
right.
everything is going to jump out at you. Whereas someone who's habituated to that workflow, that's just like, oh, that's the way it is. It makes me think of one of the concepts in the book or one of the principles in the book is visualizing it, visualizing the workflow, and with an assembly line, obviously, or some, like a Harley factory, everything is there. It's all visual, basically, right? Except for
Yeah.
maybe accounting or something like that. But if you take, say, software, or you take like biotech, or these things that are not physical processes that you can just see, what you're talking about in your book is you need some sort of a visual concept for the workflow through all the steps of the process. And can you talk a little bit about that, of like ways that you have helped organizations visualize that flow so that everyone can see all the potential bottlenecks?
Yeah, it's a big part of our sort of effort and our tool set. And you're exactly right about physical work. In retrospect, well, so I should say first off, most of the major innovations in work design have come in factories, Toyota Production System and Total Quality Management and stuff like that. The agile method in software development is probably the one exception to that, which I can talk more about in a second. But in retrospect, it's not a surprise because I think physical work is just easier to design well for exactly the reason you cite, which is physical work just tends to give you signals when something goes wrong. So if you take, a classic assembly line with cars or motorcycles or whatever, if that assembly line breaks and the work suddenly stops moving, right, that is apparent to everyone in the factory, and the supervisor, the plant manager is probably going to quite naturally run over to the operator. Hey, what's wrong? Why is it stopped? What can I do? Right? It kind of naturally brings help towards it. Knowledge work is totally different. So if you take software development or any administrative process, right, most of the work is in my email inbox or on my computer. And when we were getting ready for this podcast, like I do my part and then I send it to you, and then I don't ever see that work again until we reconnect. And so therefore, it becomes much more difficult to manage the work for the simple reason is that we have no idea whether it's moving or not, right?
Right.
If I send a task off to another colleague, I don't know how long it's going to be in their inbox
Hmm.
or whether they're working on it. And, when I teach this in class, I often sort of make this little joke, which isn't really a joke. It's like, if you think about your organization at this moment while you're listening to me, someone in your company, right, their work is probably stopping right at this minute, right? They've come across a problem that they can't solve or a question they can't answer, right? That assembly line has stopped. But because it's not physical work, when are you going to find out about it, right? Maybe they'll
Right.
text you, maybe they'll email you. But back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, they may not want to tell their boss that they don't know how to solve this problem. So they think about, I'll just sleep on it and I'm sure I can get it tomorrow. And before you know it, weeks or months have gone by. And so it's just slowed the discovery of the problem. And so now when you finally get around to fixing it, it's going to be way more expensive than if they had just showed you then. So the trick that we've had enormously good luck with is what we call visual management. And basically, it's nothing more than giving the work some kind of visual or physical manifestation so that you can see when it's moving or not moving. And the system that we actually like the best, although is less effective in this remote world, is just markers and post-its. Every project you have in your organization, put it on a post-it note and draw a picture of
Yep.
your process on your whiteboard and just move the post-it note forward. So, okay, we've completed the concept phase and we're in the detailed design phase or we're in the testing phase. And when people do that, once they kind of create that little representation and then, meet in front of the board weekly to sort of move the post-its forward, boy, so many good things start to happen really quickly. Because, for example, wow, that post-it hasn't moved for 3 weeks. Well, so Michael, what's going on? Well, I don't know how to solve this coding problem. Okay, now we can bring some resources to sort of unlock that. Whereas who knows when we would have found out that before. The other thing that we see is that when we get people to put all their work in some kind of visual representation, post-its or otherwise, they always discover that they have 3 or 5 times as much work in the system as they have resources to tackle. Knowledge work, the other thing that makes it hard is work just kind of creeps in from all sorts of different parts of the organization. And so most people are perpetually overloaded, which just kind of creates an express lane into those firefighting dynamics we've talked about before. So almost anything you can do to visualize the flow of your work
Yeah.
so that you can kind of see it and interact with it turns out to be really, really helpful typically.
That's awesome. I mean, we really are visual creatures, really. It's like we think in pictures, and it's like if you have some sort of a workflow that is just happening under the surface and you don't have visual, you're going to forget about it unless it is urgent. So
Yeah.
I love the visualization process. It makes me think about in the book, there is an example of when you all worked with the Broad Institute there in Cambridge
Yeah.
and how they were like overwhelmed with workflow and they were growing like crazy. And there was even some rock stars in there, like really trying to make things go. But it wasn't until they instituted literally like post-it notes, I think, right? And that seems super old school, but like it's a representation that you can track the actual flow. And once people got that initial awareness of like, oh my God, like we're trying to fit all this stuff, like the traffic metaphor, this off ramp from a freeway and everything's all clogged. And there's a story in there where they create something called a parking lot. Can you talk about that when they did that?
Yeah, so the folks at Broad, so it's the Broad Institute is the world's leader in gene sequencing. It actually grew out of the Human Genome Project, which most people have probably heard of. And their mission is just to bring sort of genetic science to improve medical outcomes. And so they're
Mhm.
doing incredible work, and that I only barely understand in terms of understanding the genetic origins of cancer and schizophrenia and so on and so forth. The group we worked with, and they've been our lead users from the very beginning. A bunch of them are former, luckily for me, are my former students. Is they're basically taking gene sequencing technology and developing sort of new analysis methods and so on and so forth. And the problem that they had when we first met them was really typical of R&D organizations, which is they just had tons of projects, nothing would kind of get done, and then suddenly it would raise to the highest priority, and then there'd be this big kind of firefight to get it finished, and then they would kind of get it out the door, and then suddenly another project would be on fire. And it was just chaos, and they couldn't really predict when work was going to get done, and everybody was working super hard. But it was just a chaotic big mess. And so they used exactly the technique I described, which is they created a simple map of how the projects flowed through the organization, and then each project got a post-it note. And then they started meeting in front of the board once a week just to update, okay, is this post-it ready to go forward? If not, why not? And they discovered, I think, a couple things really quickly. Number one, they had way too much work in the system. And it's not surprising. I always joke, like, if you have an organization staffed by smart, competent people, they're always going to have more good ideas and you're going to have resources to execute. And that was really true there because these are like the smartest, computational scientists and, molecular biologists in the world. And they had a lot of good ideas, right? And what would happen is someone would have a good idea and they'd start working on it, but without really thinking about the other priorities they had and so on and so forth. And so what the visual board really helped them do is move those tough conversations up front of, okay, we can only work on 10 projects. Let's just get together and have the difficult conversation of we're going to work on these 10 and we're going to put these other ones, in some kind of waiting area. And then the kind of parking spaces, what they had is that in between each step in the process, they would only allow a certain number of projects into the process. And so those were the parking spaces. If you didn't have a parking space, then that car had to wait at the first on-ramp. And what it forced them to do is really reduce the amount of work that they had in the process at any given time. But what that meant is that with the right number of projects in there, the work really flowed. And so then they were starting to get things done on a much more predictable, much more regular basis, because they had kind of matched the loading to the number of resources they had. And they did the same thing in the lab when they were processing samples. And, I will say as a lifetime academic, when people have gotten on top of this, the magnitude of the gains are so big sometimes that I'm kind of scratching my head like, is this real? But we've seen it enough times that, two and three and four-fold improvements in the
Wow.
productivity of the system. And I think what's going on there, again, to link back to what we talked about earlier, is I think the costs of living in that firefighting mode are much higher than people give it credit for.
Yeah.
You're wasting so many resources of switching back and forth between tasks and overhead. What was I working on? And I think that's why crises were so efficient, right? If I give you one thing to do and I just get out of your way, I think, okay, now you can focus, you can get it done. That's what typically happens in a crisis, whereas in sort of peacetime, so to speak,
Hmm.
we're working on 50 different good ideas and none of them get done. So yeah, they've had really good luck with it. And I would say that, one last thing is, we always say the magic's not the post-its. The post-its are really helpful, but the magic is the quality of the conversation the team has in front of that board, right? So that one weekly meeting just forces a lot of good conversations about, okay, what's important? What are we going to do? What problems we need to solve? What are we going to work on this week? And then go away and get it done. And it really does work. Even after studying this for more than a decade, like I'm still kind of surprised about how effective it can be in some cases. So
It's funny. It's like slow down to speed up, right?
yeah, exactly right. Well, and it
Right.
really is focus, right? If
Yeah.
if you had one thing to do and I said, okay, how long does it take if I don't distract you with anything else? Like, okay, maybe it takes a week or a month. But if I
Mhm.
insert that thing into the flux of the rest of your life, that probably quintuples because, well, I got to make time for it and I got other things. And so a lot of this is just really, again, sort of forcing that difficult conversation about what are the
Mhm.
real priorities in your organization or your life. And let's just work on that. And then when that's done, we can move on to the next thing. And that produces a lot of efficiency when you have the discipline to do it.
Yeah. It seems so hard for like an ambitious individual or CEO or a company where you all this work you could be doing and there's so much demand for your product or service. You want to say yes, yes. And so it's like counterintuitive. You got to say no so that you can grow correctly and grow bigger and grow stronger. Um, so that's part of it too, is like saying no to things. It must be so hard with the organizations you work with.
Yeah, and I think it is definitely the most counterintuitive thing of all the stuff I
Yeah.
teach for exactly the reason that you highlight. And I think and what's counterintuitive is what we're saying is that by starting less, you get more done, right? And that just
Mhm.
doesn't kind of add up. But again, I think it's because people don't understand that when you start too much, there's just the overhead of the task switching and the fighting is really, really high, much higher than people appreciate. Um, and so the thing that you have to get across with the executives and leaders of these organizations is, again, if you have the hard conversation up front and you only do as much as that you have resources to do, then you're going to get what you want at the other end and in a predictable fashion. If you put twice as much work in there as you have resources to do, now the system is sort of making the decision about what you work on and what you don't. And then it's actually much less predictable. And this is one of the things, kind of looping back to Harley. One of the things we discovered early in that work is that there were some project managers that always got their projects done on time and some that really struggled. And so we kind of dug into, well, what makes a really good firefighter? And of course, what we learned, which is kind of obvious in retrospect, is the good firefighters had better networks to the resources in the organization they needed to get stuff done, right? So if I needed, services in the test lab, right? I might go over to my buddy in the test lab, who, by the way, I hang out with on the weekends and we ride motorcycles and go ice fishing together and the whole shooting match. And it's like, hey, Michael, can you just move my project to the top of the
Uh-huh.
list? Yeah, of course, because I don't want you to be mad at me at bowling this week or whatever. But what it meant is that the good firefighters were just destabilizing the organization at every juncture because they were kind of pushing their projects to the fore.
Mhm.
And what it also meant is that who was really determining the strategy of Harley Davidson wasn't the senior executives in the in the product planning committee. It was the social network of the project managers,
Mhm.
right? So it's a hard thing to get your head around, and those no
Yeah.
conversations are tough. But once you build that skill, it gives you so much more control, and then you're choosing your strategy, and you're kind of managing the system rather than it managing you. It's the organizational equivalent of like taking charge of your life in some sense. And it's hard, but it makes a big difference. And I will say with Broad, they've gotten really good at it, and they still fall off the wagon every so often. But now they can see the signs when they've overloaded themselves, and
Yeah.
then they kind of bring it back. Because again, our eyes are always bigger than our stomachs. We're like, oh, we just got
Mhm.
this one new idea, and of course we can
Mhm.
sort of squeeze it in there. And if you're not careful, you're right back down the slippery slope. So
I love that our eyes are bigger than our stomachs, right? So it's like that's a great metaphor. I'm so hungry, all this great food, this
right,
all here, all this
exactly.
opportunity, and you stuff yourself and you regret it, right?
Yeah,
Because you overwhelmed the
yeah.
system. So it must be so, again, challenging to sell people on this, you have to work within the physical reality confines of a system. You can't break the laws of physics, right?
Yeah.
But once you sell them on that, and once they start seeing the results and they see the improved morale too, because you're working with humans and humans get discouraged, they get frustrated, they get resentful, and all that energy is, vibing low if you're doing this firefighting up and down yo-yo. So I think it's great work that you're doing. And this book, by the way, is really accessible to anyone. There's so much great storytelling in there and just inspirational stories about how organizations that you think might not even make it because they're so overwhelmed, and then they turn it around with some of these dynamic systems. Nelson, let me ask you: have you ever, without naming any names, and maybe this is a bad question, I don't know, but like worked with an organization where like you've tried to sell them on it, and it's just hopeless. Like they're not buying it.
Yeah, it happens pretty regularly, and I can answer that question two ways. So it has definitely happened to me several times, and then also I often have students who will take my class and they'll do a great project and they get really excited about it. And there are definitely cases where they've left their organization because they realize that I have discovered that there's a whole new level of performance and it's fun and I like doing this work and my company doesn't want to get better, right? And so I'm going to go
Yeah.
look somewhere else. So yeah, I've definitely seen it. It's very frustrating. And I think what's going on there is, it's funny. Like, I mean, if you read the business press, like, there's all this discussions. It's so competitive out there, and everyone's trying to increase shareholder value, and kind of all this hype about, how it's a dog eat dog world. There's a lot of companies that, kind of coast along. They make some money, everyone gets paid, and they go home, and people are comfortable. And I've tried to make peace with the fact, as hard as it's been for me, that some people don't want to do better. They're perfectly happy with where they are. And if you think back to, when we were bike racers, like, there's a lot of folks that really always wanted to get better, and there's other, they enjoyed the sport and they showed up and that was good too. And again, that's kind of not how I'm wired, but
No.
um, I think there's that. And then I also think, so, I mean, I think that's fine, actually. And again, I've sort of worked to make peace with that. And then I think there's a much more pathological case of organizations that really do have serious problems. And, I will definitely won't name names here, but I've certainly come across a few. And I think the executives there, it's a leadership thing. They just are
Hmm.
not willing to kind of walk into that candor in the way that we talked about
Yeah.
earlier and, make peace with the fact that, and I get it, like, if I've been leading an organization for 20 years and I have to kind of look in the mirror and say, well, the reason we're in this mess is because of decisions that I made, that's a hard thing to do. Now, I don't think that they made those decisions with bad intentions. I think it was just, they did the best with the knowledge, but it can be a big mental hurdle to sort of try to behave differently. And I would say, this is the slightly dark side of dynamic work design is in the implementations and companies we worked with, it's a small number, but we occasionally run across a person that just cannot work this way.
Mm.
Um, either they're not comfortable surfacing problems or they can't kind of confront their past. And, they either become a big impediment to progress or in some cases, depending on where they sit, they leave the organization
Mhm.
and go someplace else. And it's been a small minority, but it definitely does happen. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, that's the thing when you're working in consulting, trying to help people. It's like the person needs to first of all, like admit that there's a problem.
right,
So like getting
exactly.
back to some of the work I do working in a family system is like, no, I don't have a drinking problem, right? And
Right.
if the that's the first step is admitting that there's a problem.
Yeah.
And it is really tricky in your work because you can have this slightly dysfunctional organization that's making profits, they're doing
Yeah.
okay, right? But you can see that potential. And unless they see either the potential or the actual problem, there's no movement there, right?
Yeah, and I think, it's funny, one of my other roles at MIT is I'm in charge of our leadership center right now, and I call this the Steve Jobs objection, right? So
Hmm.
we talk about all this stuff in our class that, it's probably very similar to your work about understanding your past and how
Mhm.
it connects to how you are and how do you connect with people. And, we're all imperfect and we all have failure modes and so on and so forth. And invariably, as I'm kind of going through this intro, someone will raise their hand and, basically they'll say like, well, I read the Isaacson biography, and Steve Jobs could be kind of a jerk, but Apple Computer was enormously successful, so shouldn't I be like him? And I think the logical fallacy there is, sometimes people and companies are successful because of, you know, one dimension of their company or their personality, right? Steve Jobs was obviously a genius and had, an incredible sense of, what customers wanted. And that, obviously more than compensated for whatever sort of personality challenges he had. And Harley went through this at one point too, right? They were so successful and they had the zeitgeist of their customers so successfully that they could screw a lot of other things up and still make, more money than they knew what to do with. And boy, that's a difficult environment to change when,
Yeah.
you're being rewarded for some of those dimensions. And so you can kind of safely not look at the other ones. But, the world changes, right?
Yeah.
And, suddenly you have formidable competitors or, you've missed a technology generation or something like that. And then suddenly all those things that you kind of didn't have to worry about because you were so successful can really be a big, big problem. And so, we try to coach our students that, better to look at it now, than to
Right.
wait until you're forced into that because not every company survives those kinds of troughs. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
it's
think
hard.
I think it's inevitable, even if you're a behemoth, like there's going to be innovation. There's going to be game-changing companies that come along or events or whatever it is. And if you're not proactive, getting to like one of the principles of Stephen Covey, like if you're not willing to surface these problems and be proactive about it, like, yeah, you could last 10, 20 years, but then one day you're going to be already behind. So you got to be dynamic about it. You got to be able to pivot and you got to actually want to look for problems, right?
Yeah, and I think, yes, I totally agree. And I actually think, particularly for repetitive work, like if you take the 30-second history of work design, up until maybe 1900, most of what we did was very craft and bespoke. So every pair of shoes was a little bit different and so on. And then I'm glossing over zillions of pages of history, but, then Frederick Winslow Taylor and Henry Ford come along and we have the moving assembly line and standardization. And lo and behold, it was a lot more efficient to make the stuff we did the same way every time. The consequence of that, though, was the work, I think, was incredibly tedious, right? So if you were a factory worker, in the middle of the 19th century, I'm bolting on wheels, whatever, exactly the same way every day. It just, our brains just don't like that. Again, you know that better than me. I think one of the underappreciated geniuses of the Toyota scheme, which we've tried to capture in our work, is when I change your job description from do the work to do the work and find the next way to make the work better, I'm not sure it's ever going to change an assembly line job into being a novelist, but it does make it, quite a bit more entertaining. And so I think work's a lot more satisfying when people can, are constantly engaged in improving it because there's some agency that's involved. And so
Yeah.
I think for those companies that get a little too comfortable, um, you know, their work would be more fun actually if they could maybe have a little bit more of a sort of a company level growth mindset and
Yeah.
and find the next level of improvement and search out those problems. But I think when you're successful and the world is telling you you're the best company ever or the best
Mhm.
leader ever, it can be hard to kind of engage in that because some ways it feels contrary to all the signals you're getting. So
Yeah. Yeah. We were talking before the podcast about this company called Power Bar.
yeah,
I started in Berkeley, California, where I used to live, and I had the really the honor of working there when they first started, just as like a part-time job. And it was great to see how they really took on all the stuff that you're talking about, because leadership was really good. And I actually worked on an assembly line, Nelson. I worked on an actual assembly line,
it's a
and
good experience. Everyone should do it.
it was such an education. It was unbelievable. And how they would pivot and rotate, they would actually rotate positions throughout the day to keep people fresh. And it worked like a charm. And so that even the most mundane of organizations, there's always room for improvement. Even if you're at the top of your game, leader of the pack, there's going to be someone chasing you. You got to be ready to innovate. And if you have this dynamic mindset, you can be prepared for anything unexpected that comes along. So I I think it's great work that you're doing. I think everyone should get the book. It's there's got to be a better way because there's always a better way, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I love it. Nelson, it's been great talking with you today and catching up after all these years. We used to race bikes together, and I think we both have a similar mindset. There's always a better way, right? Always
Exactly.
growth. Where can people find out more about your organization, what you do online?
Yeah, so I think three places. Probably, for the most immediate updates, just send me a friend invite on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect with people. That's definitely my main outlet for kind of new work. And book's going to come out in August. I'll start posting links and promotional stuff in another month or so. So definitely connect with me. Always happy to connect with folks. Second, if you go just search my name on the MIT website, you can find both my personal webpage and then the MIT Leadership Center is another place where we don't change it as often, but you can learn a little bit more what we do. And then if you're interested in, getting some help with design stuff, shiftgear.work is kind of my commercial side. You can see the logo there up above my shoulder. And you can go to that website as well, and we'd be happy to chat with you about if there's stuff we can help with.
Awesome. I love it. Nelson, great conversation. I think people are going to get a lot of value out of
Great.
today's
Thank you.
podcast. So much great information. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you. It was really a lot of fun. I appreciate it.